This is a painting demonstration on how to glaze with oil paint. Glazing in oil has a certain mystique surrounding it because of the beautiful luminosity that can be achieved from painting in thin, transparent layers of color. When painting in glazes, there are certain steps to respect. I'll start with a monochromatic underpainting that will recreate the composition as precisely as possible. The reason is that the subsequent layers of paint will be transparent, allowing the underpainting to show through it. Each layer of paint must be dry before another layer is added on top. This demo has 3 layers of color. If this is the first time that you're glazing in oil, I suggest you start with an easy subject that has a simple color structure. I've chosen to do a landscape image that uses 2 colors. Here's the source image. The 2 colors are a warm pink and a cool blue-gray. They're in fact complementary colors. In step 1, I'm going to tone the canvas. I've mixed out some Payne's gray and a bit of white on my palette. With a large hog brush that has been slightly dampened in odorless mineral spirits, I'm going to cover the canvas. I'm using a dry brush technique. This means that there's no painting medium or solvent mixed into the paint. Once I've covered the canvas, I'll take a clean cotton rag and rub down the surface as much as possible. This will remove the excess paint and leave a slight tone of gray on the canvas. Step 2 is just drawing the composition. So I just take my initial mix of gray paint and do a simple drawing on my canvas. For step 3, I'm going to mix out several tones of gray and white. Here's my palette before I start to apply the paint. I have several tones of Payne's gray mixed with titanium white. For step 4, I'm going to be adding the lights and the darks to the composition. By the way, if you're not sure about how to translate color into tone, turn your image into a black and white one, like this. Here we go. I start with the light tone of the sky. I start with my lightest tone, which is essentially just white. I apply it to the edge of the mountain and then blend up into the sky. I then jump down to the bottom of the image and start applying some darks. I'm not putting too much paint, and I'm scumbling it over the surface to blend it. Each time I add paint, I gently blend it into the surface. I'll do this a few times until the underpainting has a light-dark structure that I want to see. Step 5 is your waiting time. So before I come back to the painting, I have to wait for the underpainting to dry. It has to be completely dry. No half measures here. If it isn't dry, it's not possible to scrub a transparent glaze of color over top. So now it's time to mix out my colors for my first glaze. But before I start, I have to plan to see what will happen. Let's go back and look at the original image to figure out the colors. The colors are a warm pink and a cool grayish blue. These are, in fact, complementary colors. So I'm going to use a naphthol red and a phthalo blue green shade to be exact. Let's do a quick review of a bit of color theory. If I mix these 2 colors together, they'll neutralize each other or gray each other out. Depending on the amount of red that I put into the blue, or the amount of blue that I put into the red, I'll get either a dull blue or a dulled out red. When I add white to these mixtures, I'll get beautiful chromatic grays. When I glaze transparent colors, I want to achieve these chromatic grays by creating an optical mix of color rather than the physical mix of color that I just showed you on my palette. Here's a computer version of what I'm talking about. When the transparent red square is laid over top of the blue one, a gray area results. This is what happens when there's an optical mix of color. So here are the colors that I'm going to be using. I have 2 pale tones of naphthol red. I'm using zinc white because it's a semi-transparent white, which is exactly what I want to make a transparent glaze. I also have a bit of Camblin painting medium on my palette. I'm using the solvent-free gel. It's a mixture of linseed oil and an alkyd medium in the gel form. It will make a smooth glazing mix and it will dry fairly fast. I only put a bit of medium in the paint, no more than about 30%. Here's the first application of color. As I apply the paint, I'm scumbling it onto the surface. A scumble is the equivalent of scrubbing the paint across the surface with the brush, not using too much paint. This creates a very thin film of color on the surface. This thin film of color is essentially transparent. I lay in the pale pink on the edge of the first mountain and then blend it upwards towards the top. As I blend upwards, the paint dissipates into the gray at the top of the mountain. I continue along the rest of the mountain, blending upwards to the peaks. Notice how when I cross over to the next mountain, how the underpainting is still showing through. Isn't that neat? That's the transparency of the glaze doing its job. When I do the sky, I blend the pink upwards and let it disappear. I lighten the sky a bit more to allow the next glaze of blue to be as clean as possible. I don't want that gray to dull it down. I brush a pale white mix down so it will softly blend into the pink of the lower sky. To darken the lower mountains, I add a bit more red into my pale mix of pink to make it a bit darker. I apply this tone to the middle mountain. The middle mountain has a bit of light streaming through on it, so I make sure that it's a bit lighter there. Next, I apply a slightly darker red to the lower mountains. I'm careful about how much paint I apply. If the paint seems too opaque, I scrub it out with a dry brush to lift the extra color. The scumbling keeps the paint layer transparent. Once the whole surface is covered, I go back over it with different tones of pink and clean up my edges. I lighten or darken areas by adding a bit more paint, always blending them through, lifting off excess color and maintaining transparency. Now I have to wait for the glaze to dry. Remember, it has to be completely dry before I put the next layer of color on. In step 8, I'll prepare the next glaze of color. It's a few mixtures of phthalo blue and zinc white. Both are semi-transparent colors, so they're great for glazing. I'll be using mostly soft sable or synthetic brushes to apply the paint and blend it through. I start with the upper sky. I apply the paint and then blend it downwards to the horizon. As I blend down with a soft dry brush, the paint disappears onto the surface. The same sky blue tone is lightly applied to the top of the background mountains. It's brushed down to disappear into the pink at the separation between the mountains. Each time I blend, I use a dry brush that has not been dipped into paint. The middle range of mountains gets the middle tone blue. I apply the paint along the edge and blend it down with a dry brush. A paler blue is put at the mountain base and blended upwards. The mountain is then accentuated with a touch more dark blue. I repeat the same process with the foreground mountains using the darkest blue mixture on my palette. I blend the dark blue onto the surface with a dry brush. This removes any excess paint, allowing the red underneath to make the blue appear somewhat grayish. This is what an optical mixture does. After refining the tones of the foreground mountains, I return to the upper sky and apply more of the initial light blue mixture. This will add more intense blue to the sky. I delicately blend in the added paint with a soft red sable brush, allowing it to disappear down into the pink. The darks of the composition are strengthened a bit more to bring out the contrasts. Here's my finished study. I hope you found this little introductory lesson of glazing with oil paint useful. If you're interested in a review, you can visit my blog at www.bmf-art.blogspot.ca. You can see my paintings at bmfineart.com. Thank you for watching. This is Bronca saying see you next time. Bye-bye.